we've got a very substantial session, so let me first introduce myself. I'm Becky Laboon. I'm the chair of the Public Member Committee, which is the organization that has arranged this quarterly session. The other members of the Public Member Committee are identified on our webpage, on the ICE webpage. You can locate it by going from the homepage, going to communities, and within communities, going to public members, and you'll see a list of all the members of our committee, plus a multitude of other resources for public members and for people who are interested in how in the institution of public membership. And this session is being recorded and will be added to the resources on the public members webpage within probably a week, I guess.
I also want to ask you, you said to her, could you cover the air conditioner? But I don't see where you say the cover's in the closet and the bungee cord is in the closet.
Somebody, please
No,
mute.
it was in the shed, and that's what I said.
Please mute yourself, whoever's talking about the bungee cord. Quick introductions of the speakers. Janice Moore, many of you probably know, is the principal at Seacrest, and among other things, helps certifying organizations get accredited. Todd Philbrick is the Chief Certification Officer for the Hearing and Speech Language people and is the current president of the ICE board. And Grady Barnhill has had a long and distinguished career working for a number of healthcare professional certification organizations, and he has a special fondness for recertification. Okay. Next slide, I guess.
All right, fantastic. That's me. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Before we kind of dive into our content, I just want to touch on a couple of terms that we'll be using to make sure that we're all working from the same definition. So we will talk about recertification today, or I will call it renewal or maintenance of certification interchangeably. But what we mean by that is, renewing certification based on specific requirements that are completed within a specific time frame. Those requirements could be anything from continuing education to testing to self-assessment, although continuing education, as we'll talk about, is still one of the most popular options. And then we'll also talk a lot about continuing competence today, by which we mean demonstrating specific level of skills, knowledge, and abilities throughout an individual's career. So with that, Grady, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started. Becky, I see you're saying something, but I can't hear you.
There we go. Classic mute mistake. There we go.
Yes, I forgot to mention, please use the chat box if you have questions or comments. We have allocated time at the end for that, but as I said, we've got kind of a tight schedule, and if you have a comment or a question that we don't get around to, if you put it in the chat box, we'll answer you afterwards. Okay, sorry, Grady.
All right, thanks. It's a great question. Why should public members care about recertification? Aren't we all happy with what we're doing? I mean, we get very few complaints. And I think it's true that generally our recertification processes work pretty well for most people. However, there are some reasons to care about this. One is that the research is pretty clear that we kind of all go steadily downhill in terms of our knowledge and skills. Hate to say that as an older person, but it's just true. Unfortunately, it's not so true that we get better and better like a fine wine. The suggestion is we get steadily less and less knowledge for reasons both of obsolescence as well as decay. That which we might remember, we may have forgotten things that we used to know, and some of the things we do remember may now be obsolescent. So that's a real good reason there just to care about continuing competence. The other thing to think about is the number of malpractice cases, for example, is small. There's not a large number of them, but they're significant, and they're certainly not zero. So I think what we need to think about is how can we protect the public from those practitioners that that really need it. And that's, I think, a good basis for some of the questions you might ask as a public member. The research also is pretty clear on just regular untargeted continuing education with no enhancements, that tends to not be very helpful in terms of practitioner changes or in terms of improving healthcare outcomes or outcomes of any kind. So what we have learned more about what kinds of CE are helpful. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's fair to think that we need to be focused on those practitioners who might constitute a harm to the public. So it's useful to think about risk and why we have high stakes certifications. And I think it's good to ask why we're focusing so much effort on initial certification. We have psychometricians lined up to do great work with initial certification. But when it comes to recertification, we kind of slack off for the most part. Isn't CE enough? So next time we get to talk, I'll answer some more questions about what else we might want to ask as public members. So I think my time is probably taken up, so I'll try and be quiet now.
Thanks, Grady. And a lot of what you talked about sort of was also discussed. So the American Speech Language Hearing Association, December 2019, in a time where COVID had just started to reach our medical web pages, ASHA held a conference called The Future of Learning that brought together 8 councils, committees, boards that were really focused on learning. Everything from bachelor's level to end of career specialist expertise. Some of them were just focused on qualitatively measuring CE. Some of them were accrediting graduate programs. Obviously, I lead the certification team, so we were focused on entry-level certification and also renewal. But as Grady mentioned in his intro, I think just about I don't know of a certification board, haven't met them yet, where they say we spend equal or more time talking about renewal than we do about entry-level practice. So we were really focused on that, and sort of the thought was, if we focus on providing opportunities to enhance learning and enhance education, to foster it, multiple modalities, framework, etc., that you'd be learning more, whether you were going, you were learning more about a specific topic, you were broadening your knowledge in an area, etc. And our hope is that it'll lead to a better prepared, more effective workforce. And whether you are an audiologist focused mostly on hearing, or an SLP, which has a much broader scope of practice. And we now actually certify their assistants and the support personnel. So we got into a breakout session, and a lot of it was focused on competency-based entry-level standards. I think that'd be a great topic for a future public member forum to learn about that. But the other part, and rare instance where we spent more time talking about the folks that have been certified and practicing for 10 years, 20 years, etc., was talking about this continued competency. We had a lot of philosophical debates on the mission. Should our 3-year cycle, should it be about continued competency? Should it be about enhanced competency? It's a little bit complicated because ASHA certification is an entry-level, broad-based certification. If you're not familiar with audiologists and SLP, there isn't a federation or national board composed of state licensure exams. They use the examination that we use for certification, and a lot of their standards for practice also mirror what's in our accreditation and certification standards. So that sort of complicated things. And we were also limited sort of in our thinking. I shouldn't say limited in our thinking, limited in putting something too progressive out there, because limited, unlike other healthcare professions, there's really limited advanced and specialty certifications in the universe. The whole thought, and in some ways it makes my job easier. I don't lose any sleep about renewal. So I'm the rare certification person that doesn't lose sleep on that. Everyone gets certified, everyone stays certified for 30 years until they retire, because maybe 600 or 800 out of 225,000 have an advanced or specialty certification. We also sort of, as a part of this, we talked about should versus must, that I think a lot of programs, well, you must remain competent, you know, you should be advancing your competency. So how's that all factor in? As a part of this, one of my first steps, I think probably coming in the Monday after the meeting, is I reached out not only to ICE, Denise Rosenthal, but then also Janice, and said, hey, do you know, is there any data as to what everyone else is doing for recertification and renewal? And the answer was, there actually surprisingly wasn't at that time a big glossary or directory of what other programs are doing. So I was lucky enough to work with Janice on this. So Janice, do you want to take it over and talk a little bit about the research study?
Sure. Yep. So when Todd gave us a call, that's what we did, is we went out and looked at the publicly available information for 100 different accredited programs. We decided to specifically focus on accredited programs so we would know that the models of recertification we were looking at were going to be consistent with accreditation requirements. So that was most useful in his situation. And on the next few slides, we'll look at what most programs are doing now and some of the emerging trends that we identified in that research. A few of the things I thought were interesting is that although we found some information on kind of new and innovative models that we'll talk about, the most prevalent requirements for recertification are still continuing education, making sure you follow a code of conduct or code of ethics, and then for a lot of groups, passing an exam, although I think that was less than half. Most organizations that are requiring continuing education are granting credit for a wide range of activities, from going to a workshop or an online seminar or conference to participating in exam development or even doing volunteer work in their field. And for most, recertification time periods range from 2 to 5 years. Those are the most common time ranges. And for most programs, about 60%, they're giving some kind of grace period if you allow your certification to lapse or expire. There's some way you can't keep using it, but there's some way to get it back without having to completely start over from scratch, basically. I should also mention that there is an article that Todd and I authored in Credentialing Insights on the website where you can link, I think, to the full survey results, or the article includes the survey results, and then the ICE study is on the website as well. So this slide looks at what we found in the research to be kind of the most typical model of recertification that exists now. We saw that there is an increasing number of organizations that are looking at innovative and more robust, for sure, methods of recertification, but the number there is still pretty small, and the majority are using this pretty traditional model. So what the average program looks like is you have one pathway to recertification. Recertification is most often required every 3 years. Like we mentioned before, continuing education is still the predominant requirement, with a variety of things accepted for that. And requirements are typically just required at the end of that 3-year cycle, not at some type of midpoint, which we saw with some of the more emerging models. And Todd, I will hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Janice. And Devonta, you want to go back to the current slide for just a few seconds? So we got this report, and I'll talk on the next slide a little bit more about sort of the more progressive, innovative, rigorous methods for continuing your certification that are existing. It really hurt my heart because when we got the data, I wanted to be progressive. I wanted to do something more forward thinking, and also something that would provide greater assurance to the public that someone who's been doing this for 22 years is still or more competent than they were 22 years ago when they passed their initial board exam. So that being said, what we found is those more progressive, innovative, rigorous types, they were mostly in fields that were advanced specialties, smaller scopes of practice, at least when it came to healthcare, which is what our folks do. So at the end of the day, we stayed right where that third bullet is, which is continue to continue to require 30 hours of CE every 3 years. We have a little slight modification on that makes it a little bit different. But also we agreed we would look at this every 3 to 5 years to see, does this still make sense? How has the art and science of continuing competency changed in that time frame? And Devontae, if you want to go on to the next one. So talking a little bit about these innovative and emerging approaches. So we have essentially, I think PTs are an example of it. A lot of their CE requirements, there has to be a quiz embedded with a passing score on it up front. Those are the only types of CE they accept to renew your specialty certification, and the 6 or 8 types of specialty certification they offer. They're the longitudinal assessments with various plugins built in. Every 2 years, you check in with a smaller number of CE. And then when you get to a 10-year cycle, you might have something else to do with it. I got a little bit ahead of myself. I had mentioned we did something that was a little bit on that first bullet point with that informs that we do a little bit of directed learning. So you have to do a couple hours of continuing of cultural competency, a couple of hours of supervision and ethics, but for the most part, 25 of the 30 hours, it's pick your own adventure. I think when we looked at other healthcare certification boards, you would see things like CPR. CPR would be a common thing for healthcare. There's now a lot of stuff for child and elder abuse. You might see in terms of directed learning, you have to stay competent in this stuff. Recertification exams, I think maybe a question that maybe Janice already has in her mind when it comes to accreditation of future slide that I'd be curious to know is, so you have a recertification exam. Could it be shorter than, lower stakes, etc., than your entry level certification? How does accreditation feel about that? And then you have, longer cycles with midway check-in points. There are lots of examples in nursing where, you can renew for 3 or 4 years with just CE, but then after 6 or 8 or 10 years, you have to retake the same entry level. Well, I shouldn't say the same, the updated entry level exam you would have taken 10 years before. So a part of the reason I said we're going to hold tight and do it, check in on this every 3 to 5 years. So ASHA has a strategic objectives like just about every other organization, and our newest one is strategic objective 9, which is to transform learning across the initiative. And I'm leading the first transformative initiative on that, which is to create a competency framework for your career. So like so many other professions, you'll have an entry level. You got to have that entry level because we want to make sure you're providing safe and ethical care. And like a lot of fields, although ours aren't very well, we don't have a lot of people that have them, there are a handful of specialty certifications out there, but there's really nothing to guide you in between or to help you measure yourself in between. So we are doing this transformative initiative for competency, and I don't know whether it's going to be by practice setting yet because it just launched 3 months ago. So are we going to have a separate set of competency if you're a swallowing specialist, where usually you're going to be working, you're going to work with a lot of stroke victims, or if you're doing feeding where you're working with a lot of newborns. Or could it be like there are models that exist, and probably what we will do, at least for a start, is to look at defining competency at different stages. So student, you're a new practitioner, specialist, expert. I got to come up with a term in between, somewhere in between. You're not a new practitioner, but you're not quite a specialist. I don't want to say advanced practitioner, but we'll come up with a really good term that's that midway point, that you're not quite a specialist or an expert, and then how that can be applied to your day-to-day work based off practice settings. So really excited to be leading this, and maybe in a few years give you an update on it. So Janice, want to kick it over to you and talk about NCCA and ANSI?
Yeah, absolutely. So accreditation is voluntary, but for those programs that are accredited or aspire to be accredited, or a lot of programs just use the accreditation standards as guidelines for how they want to build things, For NCCA, and the same is true for 17024 as well, they really look to, do you have a clearly stated purpose for recertification? It shouldn't be arbitrary. It shouldn't be, well, we just do this because it's what everybody else does, or it's the way we've always done it, or it was easy for staff or whatever, but there should be a purpose, and that purpose is going to be unique to every program, but it is going to either measure or promote continued competence. And accreditation looks closely at making sure you have a rationale. And even if you're not accredited, this is a fantastic exercise for any program and for every public member to understand is what's the rationale for your requirements? Why do you require what you do, and how do those requirements specifically support the purpose for recertification? Because if they don't, then why do you have them? The same is true for the time period. How does that time period support it, whether it's 3 years or 6 years or whatever? How does that support your purpose if you're in a quickly changing field and part of your purpose is making sure your certificates are staying up to date with newly emerging information and research? Then your requirements and your time period should be in alignment with that and support it. I also put the ABSNC standards on here. That is the Accreditation Board for Specialty Nursing. And while I realize that's a small group of certification programs, I think it's relevant here because nurses have absolutely been on the forefront of a lot of recertification advancements and innovations, and their standards for accreditation reflect that. They look at how the organization is facilitating continued competence of their certificates, and they also specifically talk in their standards about the responsibility of the certification organization to not just have those requirements and those rationales, but to continually improve and assess what their methods are, and are they working, and are they getting to the purpose that they've established. And they also go beyond just the rationales and look to a specific link in terms of data from your recertification requirements back to your job analysis data. So I always find that interesting. I think that might be a little indication of where standards may well go in the future. So Grady, I think we're back to you.
All right, I think we're going to talk about what are some of those questions and what role can the public members play in recertification policy. And I think a great place to start with that is to encourage your board to focus on evidence that's in the credentialing landscape. And there is some, there needs to be more, but there's plenty of evidence to inform our process. One of the things that Janice referenced in her discussions, for example, is what evidence do we have to support our recertification cycle length? And I think for most of us that are accredited, becomes a really difficult creative writing exercise sometimes to come up with a eloquent rationale for that cycle, because I think most of us don't have really good hard evidence for that. But certainly you can think of that in terms of what are the aspects of your profession that might inform that. Certainly if you have anything to do with software or software packages, I would imagine your cycle shouldn't be much longer than a year, because so often the software packages are, there's a lot of turnover in those, sometimes multiple times within a year. I imagine if you're a geologist, maybe things don't turn over quite as much. But the rocks are going to change less than other things. And just to make sure it's good and complicated, I think in any profession, you have sometimes both kinds of knowledge, some that is more stable and some that is more perishable. If we look at healthcare, for example, I think anatomy and physiology is not going to change with great rapidity, but other things such as how the study of the human genome can affect new cancer treatments, that is changing just so rapidly as we move through time. So try and make sure that your decisions in those regards are evidence supported. I think you always, as a public member, want to ask the question, are we doing as much as we can to document or enhance the knowledge and skills of our practitioners? That's leading to things that we've kind of touched on. For example, there's a lot of evidence to support test-enhanced learning. That's article after article supports that knowledge that is acquired through testing is more readily acquired. It's also more durable and lasts longer if it's reinforced with testing. So at the very least, you might ask if your required CE includes an assessment. A lot of groups do that just to make sure there's some sort of assessment in their process. Hopefully you could move on to more advanced things such as longitudinal assessment that Todd referenced. That's a great new product. How many touch points you have? And by touch points, I mean, how many times do your practitioners need to check in? A lot of recertification cycles are long. A lot of the medical cycles are 7 or 10 years, but a lot of those have intermediate touch points every 2 years or so. And the evidence coming from spaced education, for example, suggests that having more frequent touch points is much more helpful in terms of keeping that knowledge durable and helping with its retention. I think it's one reason, circling back to the longitudinal assessment, most of those have quarterly touch points within the year. So that's really helping avoid that cramming effect. If you have a recertification exam at the end of every 10-year period, that just really reinforces that practice of just cramming, and you take the test and you forget about it for another 10 years. So that spaced education is something to keep in mind. Also feedback. What kind of feedback are we giving our practitioners? Some of the groups have assessment tools that the practitioner takes and sees where their strengths and weaknesses are, and that can be a very useful feedback. Those of you familiar with research know about the Dunning-Kruger effect, that the poorer the practitioner is, the more they tend to overestimate their abilities. So giving them feedback as to what really do they know can be very helpful at informing that self-assessment process. Also, you can encourage participation in that by providing exemptions for CE. If they take an assessment and demonstrate that they know what they need to know, then why not exempt them from CE and help incentivize that whole process? There's another question that we always touch on too, which is going to be involving specialization. Many of the professions, you start off as a generalist, but then you very quickly specialize. And so we have to ask ourselves, what do we require of those who are recertifying? Are we going to require something in the area of core plus something in specialization, or are we just going to stick with core and with the idea that you're certified or licensed to practice in any part of that professional domain? So why not just test the whole thing? A lot of models have a mixed model that helps you kind of custom that content to accommodate that specialty. So that's a very helpful thing to do. And finally, I'll mention this: the research does have suggestions for how we can make CE much more effective. Even if we do just have a CE tracker model, at least we can make some requirements on that CE that research supports. For example, interactivity is a huge thing. You want to make sure that your CE is interactive, preferably a process that allows the practitioners to practice what skills they've just been taught. That's not always easy. That can help. Having multiple sessions works very well to help reinforce knowledge. You don't see that a lot, but if you were able to have multiple sessions, it would really be a good way to make that knowledge more durable. You might also have something they call reminders. After you have gone through a continuing education course, it may be possible to send out an email reminder to the participants, sort of summarizing things that you've done in that course to remind them of what they learned. Those rehearsals help a lot in making that education stick. So those are just some things. I'll touch briefly on the last one there. Understanding strategies are helpful in advancing continuing competence. First of all, you have to understand any efforts to do this will be likely to be extremely unpopular. So obviously brace yourself for a lot of blowback from practitioners who like that untargeted CE model just fine. But I think it is our job to try and enhance public protection by trying to improve continuing competence. But you probably want to allow a little bit of a timeline there to ramp up and make sure everybody understands what's happening. Try and make sure that your communications are transparent about what you're trying to do. Involve as many stakeholders as you can, including the professional association, which can sometimes be a challenge because their job is to represent their practitioners, and most practitioners don't want to see improvements in continuing education. So however, downstream, it's helpful if you involve those stakeholders to be at the table as you're developing that turnover strategy. And then finally, while you allow a timeline to accommodate these changes, try not to let the timeline go too long. You can fall into that situation where you can research something to death. Whatever you develop is never going to be perfect, but if you try to wait for perfection, you'll never do anything. So I encourage you to make a reasonable effort and then start that program and then fine tune as you move along. I'll stop there and let others continue.
There's one more question on that's just been entered into the chat box, is if people can stay for another few minutes. If you can't stay for another few minutes, I'd like to just tell you that we're having another quarterly call in September, and the topic, the speakers there will be from the Professional Certification Coalition, which monitors federal and state legislation affecting certification, and they'll give a talk about what they're seeing, what their activities are, and how they're engaging in activities that try to protect the integrity of credentialing organizations when there's legislation that is proposed that exposes them to some. I think we have, most everybody has left. I will ask the speakers and anybody else to respond in writing to this last question that we have on the chat board. And given that,